Or I can just, all right, should be good.
Yeah, looks good.
All right, let's just get to the beginning. So welcome to Financial Education 365. My name's Dylan, and I'm accompanied with my workers Ella and Robin, and we're here to present on real estate investment. And as a notice, this is not financial advice, but this is just education for education purposes. So let's start. So first, let's just talk about the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. It was created by Carl Case, a lead housing economist, and Robert Shiller, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist. The index tracks the long-term trends in home prices. So, the historical data of this index begins in January 1987, and the index gained major attention during the housing boom of the early 2000s. It became the key indicator during the 2008 housing market crash, showing the sharp declines in home values. Today, it remains one of the most widely watched measures of United States residential real estate prices. So next, the FHFA. So what is actually the FHFA and how does it relate to now? So the FHFA is the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is an independent US government agency. The FHFA publishes the House Price Index, and this tracks the changes of single family house values. And the HPI is a list of data that shows price trends across the United States, cities, and local areas. The HPI is up to date in 2000 to the latest date as of 2026 now. The FHFA updates the HPI monthly with a larger quarterly release that includes updated monthly data and broader analysis. So next, this is the FHFA or Home Price Index of 2026. So the chart shows the Seattle home prices in the United States from 2000 to 2026. So we can see that both lines starts at 200 in the year 2000. And as we know, these two lines are going to be relative values and not actual home prices. The chart shows how much each market changed over time. And we can see Seattle reached 388 or about 3.88 times its 2000 level. And the United States reached about 310 or 3.1 times its 2000 level. Seattle's faster growth rate shows the strong demand for major technology employers and high-paying jobs, combined with the limited housing and supply. Water mountains and protected land make it hard to expand outward, increasing competition for homes. And this pattern is not unique to Seattle. Cities across the country can rise faster or slower than the national average, depending on local job growth, housing supply, geography, and demand. And we can see in the chart, Seattle is the line rising above the United States, showing that how the local conditions led to its home prices to grow faster than the national market overall. So let's talk about annual growth rate. So what is annual growth rate? Annual growth rate shows the average percentage that home values increased over each year over a period of time. It's useful because it counts for compounding instead of only looking at the total increase. So this is the formula for annual growth rate. Annual growth rate is the present home price index divided by the past index. This is then raised over 1 over the number of years subtracted by 1. So let's look at an example comparing the two prices from the chart above beforehand. So we can see the starting price index right here. And this is what we can see for Seattle, Washington. We can see the annual growth rate of Seattle, Washington to be roughly 5.35%. And now we can see the United States. Over the 26 years, the United States has an annual growth rate of about 4.45%. Now we can kind of see the comparison. We can see how Seattle's annual growth rate grew about 0.9 percentage points faster than the United States as a whole.
I'll be sharing next a little bit of like some case studies and then some focusing on to specifically rental real estate. Full screen,
Mm,
if it will let me. Okay. So now that
yes.
we've explained the Case-Shiller index and how annual growth rate works, I'm going to apply that to a specific case study. So for this case study, I chose a resident home in Seattle, Washington, since that's where I am located. According to the sale history, we see that this home was sold in April 1990 for about $336,000. Then in July of 2026, it was listed for $2,650,000. At first glance, this looks like a really large increase. And it is. The home listed for almost 8 times its original sale price. But instead of only looking at the total dollar increase, I calculated the annual growth rate, the one that Dylan talked about before. Since about 36 years had passed, we would do from 1990 to 2026, I used the compound annual growth formula. So the final rate of divided by the beginning value and then taking the 36th root and finally subtracting by 1. As we can see on the top right, we get a percentage of about 5.9. On the right of this screen, we also see the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. In April 1990, Seattle's index was around 65, and by March of 2026, it was around 388. So this supports the idea that Seattle home prices overall increased a lot in this period. But one important thing to keep in mind is that this is just one example. It doesn't reflect the whole housing market. This specific home's value could be affected by its neighborhood, renovations, land values, school districts, or even just Seattle's overall growth. Additionally, the 2026 number is a listing price, not necessarily the final price it would be sold at. So this is a useful example, but not the complete picture. The main takeaway of this slide is essentially that real estate can appreciate a lot over time, but we still need to compare it with other investment options. So now that we have the home's growth rate of 5.9%, the next question is that good? To answer that, let's compare it to the S&P 500. So the S&P 500 is a stock market index that tracks the 500 largest publicly traded US companies. It is often used as like a general measure of the US stock market. So around 1990 of June 30th, the S&P 500 was about 330.8. By July 2026, which is where we're looking today, it was around 7,483.24. Using the same annual growth formula as before, the S&P 500 had an annual growth rate of about 9.05%. So when we compare the two, the resident home grew about 5.9% per year, while the S&P 500 grew at about 9.05% per year. This means the S&P 500 had greater growth during the same time period. One reason for this is that the S&P 500 represents real companies, companies that are actively trying to grow, make profit, reinvest, innovate, and much, much more. People are spending time to put in money, labor, strategy into those businesses and make them more valuable. A house is different. A resident home doesn't automatically generate extra value in the same way. Its value mostly depends on the housing market, location, demand, and improvements made to the specific property. So this comparison shows that home appreciation can be strong, but appreciation by itself may not be other investments. However, that doesn't mean that real estate is necessarily bad. A house also gives someone a place to live, and real estate can become more powerful when it's used to generate rental income or uses financing. And now that brings me to the next section, which is rental property. So now we're moving from a resident home to rental real estate. When we talk about rental property, we're not only looking at whether a home price goes up, we also care about the cash flow. So cash flow means that money coming in from rent minus the money going out for expenses. So there are a few things to consider. First is acquisition and financing. You can see that on the slide right here. So this includes purchase price, down payment, the loan amount, and the mortgage interest rate. Second is income and growth. This includes the monthly rental income and the average of property appreciation rate. And third is cost and expenses. This includes buying and selling costs, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, HOA fees, and management fees. And lastly, there are tax considerations, like taxes on rental home, deductions, depreciation, and capital gains tax when the property is sold. So rental property is a little more complicated than just buying a house and waiting for the price to go up. It has more moving pieces since it works similarly to, I guess, a small business. And then now let's look at this in a rental property example. So For case two, I looked at a rental property again in Seattle, Washington. So this property, if we see on the left side, sold in April of 2000 for $285,000. And in 2026, it listed for rent at $5,250 per month. So for this example, the current estimated property value is about $962,000. And this isn't the same as the rent times 12, since it's the actual sale price of the home rather than paying rent for it each month for the entire year. First, the property's price growth is about 4.79% per year. This is lower than resident home example, but it's also different since it generates rental income. So to estimate the rental percentage, I took the monthly rent of $5,250 and then multiplied it by 12 and divided by the property value, the $962,000. This gives us a rental return of about $6.55 or 6.55%. So on the gain side, we have property price growth of 4.79 plus rental income of 6.55. Together, that gives us a total gain of about 11.34%. But then we need to subtract costs. The property tax is about 1.16 and insurance, HOA, maintenance are estimated at 1.1%. So the total cost gives us 2.26%. So after subtracting the cost, the return on cash we get is 9.18%. This is why rental property can be more attractive than just a resident home. Instead of only that 5.9%, we get 9.18%. And this is because the property can also bring in rent. But this slide specifically only assumes that the property is paid for in cash. In reality, most people use a mortgage or a loan, so that's why the next slide shows how to use a rental property calculator. So on this slide, we have the URL here if you'd like to access it. And this is essentially what it looks like when you open the website. So for this example, there are really only 3 or 4 main things that we want to focus on. First is the purchase price, and this is the total price of the property. For this example, we'll use $1 million. And then we'll also, second choice is whether or not we're using a loan. If we look at the red circle here, for this specific example, we'll choose no loan. And then is the closing cost. That's typically 1% of the total cost. So for the $1 million property, it will be about $10,000. And then we'll also enter the property tax. And on average in the general housing market, this is 1.12%. So now when we could calculate, we are given this sort of table. And the one thing that we want to look at is the cash on cash return. Cash on cash return basically tells us how much return we're getting compared to the cash we actually invested. In this no loan example, the numbers are pretty strong. In year one, we see about 5.3% return, and this number over time keeps increasing. By year 20, it reaches about 9.29%. Instead of focusing too much on the big number, 206.85 on the bottom, I want to focus on the individual year by year numbers. That gives us a better view of how the return grows over time, and we can see the growth compounding year after year. But now let me bring you to a second example where we do use a loan. So in this second example, it is more realistic for people because most people don't have enough money to upfront buy a property in essentially one go. So here, everything stays basically the exact same as the early example, except we changed the use loan to yes. And in this case, we also put an interest rate about 4%. This is just an example, but using it for specific property, we can use more specific numbers. So now while pressing calculate here, we get the table on the right. So when we compare these two tables, on the left, we have the version without the loan, but on the right, we have version where most people are choosing with the loan. So for the loan version, the return starts out lower. In year one, the cash on cash return is only 3.65% compared to the 5.3% without the loan. That makes sense because when you use a loan, you have to pay mortgage, and so your cash flow starts a lot lower. But as we look down the table, the cash on cash return grows much faster in the loan example. By year 20, the loan example reaches a cash on cash return of 22.85% compared to the 9.29 without the loan. That is a massive difference. This example shows us why loans can be more beneficial for cash on cash return. With a loan, you're using less money up front, but you still benefit from rental income and the appreciation of full property value. That is called leverage. Leverage can make the return look much better because you're controlling a larger asset with less cash up front. But there's also a risk. You still have to pay the mortgage, and even if the property is vacant or rent goes down or expenses increase. So the conclusion is not just loans are always better, it's just more that loans can increase cash on cash return, but they also increase risk. And now I will turn it over to Robin to cover additional details.
Right. Okay, so the long-term purpose of rental property as education funding, some some so one way that families use rental property is to help pay for children's college application and education. And while it may be an effective strategy for some families, there are a few important drawbacks to consider. First of which being market risk and market risk. In most cases, selling a rental property will generate enough money to cover your college expenses. However, if the real estate market is down when your child is ready for college, you may be forced to sell at an unfavorable time, potentially receiving far less than the property's long term value. Second of all, real estate isn't very liquid. Unlike a savings or investment account, you can't simply withdraw the amount you need for one semester's tuition, and selling a property is a major transaction that can take months to complete. Third of all, there's tax consequences. If the property has appreciated in value, selling it could trigger capital gain taxes, which reduces the amount available for educational expenses. And owning a rental property may reduce a student's eligibility for need-based financial aid, which brings us to our next topic of the FAFSA form, which FAFSA standing for Free Application for Federal Student Aid Instructions. The highlighted section states that investments include real estate and rental property, but it does not include the home you live in. This means that if your family owns rental property, its net value generally has to be reported as an investment asset or on the FAFSA. Because rental properties count as assets, they can increase a family's student aid index, or SAI, which is the number colleges use to determine eligibility for need-based financial aid. A higher SAI often means that a student qualifies for less aid. So while rental property can be a valuable long-term investment, families planning to use it to help pay for college should understand that it may reduce the amount of financial aid their student receives. And so a long-term purpose of rental property as a retirement income, there are some pros and there's some cons. And the pros being like anti-inflation, rentals provide cash flow, there's capital growth, home equity loans, reverse mortgage, and legacy, which is like inheriting property. And then another long-term goal for people who have rental properties is using them to generate income during retirement. While this can work well, there are several disadvantages. One is vacancy. If the property sits empty, then there's no rental income, but the owner still has to pay mortgages, property taxes, insurance, and utilities. Another issue is capital gains tax. If the property has increased significantly in value, selling it during retirement may result in a large tax bill. Some retirees are able to use a home equity loan to access property's values, but interest rates can fluctuate, making the loan more expensive over time. Maintenance is another ongoing expense. As properties age, repairs can become costly and unpredictable, and eventually add up to more than able to afford. Finally, rental property can create inheritance disputes if family members disagree about whether to keep, manage, or sell the property after it's passed down. For example, if you were to have it in a will, but you can't decide if you want to keep that property. And then for slide 16, why people make money in real estate is for a few different things. Despite the disadvantages stated in the previous slides, many people still invest in real estate because of its long-term wealth building potential. One reason is low liquidity. Since property isn't easy to sell, investors are more likely to hold on to it for years, allowing it to appreciate. However, this also means they can't access their money quickly during an emergency. Another factor is discipline. Making regular mortgage payments help build equity over time, but it also requires a long-term financial commitment. Real estate also provides tax advantages, but the tax rules are complex and owners may still face taxes when they sell the property eventually. Finally, investors often use leverage, meaning how they borrow money to purchase a larger asset. Leverage can increase profits when property values rise, but it also increases losses and financial risk if property values were to fall or rental income stops. Overall, these advantages explain why people invest in real estate, but they also highlight why rental property isn't a risk-free investment. Oh. That's all for my part.
Thank you for everyone who came, and that's probably going to be the end of our presentation.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much
Thank you.
for coming.
Okay, you
Yeah.
share. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. And would you like to share about there is a calculation for, let me see. You got a calculation for the real case. Let me see. When you do the rental
the
property
rental property?
calculator, yeah. So is there any website you can share about that calculator?
I can send you the in
Yeah, do
chat.
you
Would work?
wanna just put in chat? It was on
That'd be
Sure.
great.
her
Thank you.
slides, yeah. It was on her slide,
Yes.
but she'll send it in chat.
I can send it in chat right now. Let
Thank
me
you.
know if it works. Yes.
Thank you.
Let me know if that link works, and if not, I can try to send a different one.
Yes, it works. Thank you.
Okay, that's good. Is there anything else you need, or any questions you have?
I think if based on a case study may more make sense to discuss the scenario whether or not it is worth to have the rental property investment, because there are so many affected result, right? In order to determine this is a good investment, I think it's better to use one example for. Can I give you like verbally describe something? Maybe we can have a very short discussion if you have time. So for example, there is a property. Okay, you want to do investment, right? And how did you know what is the best way to determine this is a property you purchased, and based on the rental estimation and based on the tax, based on the property tax, insurance, a lot of factors, and and your loan amount, and determine they do have potentially more likely have a positive cash flow. Let's say the first year, if it is just break even, do you think in the future years it's due to be a better decision to maintain and like to keep it and to run it in the long term, or the most scenario, the first year it just break even, but later the year you keep longer, the more likely to bring you positive cash flow.
I mean, I think it is relatively like case dependent.
Right.
So you'll have to see like specifically from case to case.
Exactly. But is there any like
There's like
general
if you like the general
rule?
trend of
Right,
I guess like
general rule like
investment will go.
right.
Uh-huh.
Is there any general
Wait, sorry, could you repeat
principle
that? Oh,
you like
like a
to,
sorry.
yeah, is there any general principle you advise to make sure your decision which is more likely to bring the positive cash flow?
I'm I mean, for sure, there's nothing like there's never a situation where you can be like 100% sure. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
like there's always going to be like an inherent risk.
right.
But obviously, looking at the trends of the, let's say, like we gave examples about Seattle, Washington. So looking at the trends there, we see, let's say, more people are trying to find rental properties in Washington, which means that market is growing exponentially or something. Then we see that because of this trend is growing, that we see that this property, we can expect for it to grow and continue growing and for like the interest to keep compounding over time. So I think the biggest thing is to look at the overall trend mixed with some sense of like what's backing this trend so you understand what's the reason for it going up and then to see if there is a positive trend in general.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer your question or?
I think it's case by case. If yeah, it's it is. I agree with case by case. Also for the maintenance, I know maybe a little bit out of today's big topic. For example, do you know any information about let's say using roof as an example, the roof, every year, basically they can be lose the value, right? And if you have a house, they are on the market, they already estimated the roof probably 15 to 18 years. When you purchase this property, probably you are going to have a quick potential risk to replace them. And do you have any supporting information if you have a property about 15, 18 years old about the roof, what it will be, the timeline you need to do the replacement?
Wait, could I just ask for clarification? So, are you talking about how long it would take for, like, including the cost
So
of the roof
basically, it is
repair?
roughly what is the average roof age in Washington to be replaced?
I am not so sure of that
Average.
statistic. Age of, well, I can search that up.
On Google, it says that standard asphalt shingle roofs typically last 15 to 30 years, depending on the weather and the type.
So it is
And
big
which-
range, right? 15 to 30.
Yeah.
But it would maybe with like our weather, especially since it's a lot of water, there could be like water damage. It might be closer to the shorter end, I would say. But I'm not exactly sure since like I'm not exactly sure where the property is.
Right. So that's why I say case by case.
Yeah.
Their maintenance cost potentially can trigger as well, right? Yeah, thank you.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.